Ross has, I believe, said that I should preach on the tearing of the veil in the temple when Jesus died, and our screen may come down during the middle of that sermon. Obviously, we realize that is crooked. The one was ordered, and then it was the wrong one, and so it had to be sent back, and the new one has since come, and everything is just kind of slowed down in that production. So we are working toward that end. I know a number of people have asked about it. Tonight we're going to continue a study we started last Sunday night in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and looking at the premise of what love is. Because if you went to people, and we use this illustration, if you went to pretty much any church and you sat down with the members of the leadership and you said, do you want to grow? The answer would immediately be yes. They wouldn't even think about it. But the next question that should be asked is, are you really sure about that? Because growth requires a level of discomfort. And that love, a lot of people have this flowery idea of what love is. I'm always going to have this magical feeling as I help people, and they just transform and become, we kind of have the idea that they'll just magically become a new person because we spend, 15 minutes with them on a Sunday and a Wednesday. The only problem is that it doesn't work that way. True biblical love, to be done the way that God says it, especially in helping people, is very messy. You're dealing with broken people. We are broken people. And to learn to be patient in the development of other people as we are patient with ourselves in our own development. And so when it comes to understanding this, it's very vital. Now, when we look at 1 Corinthians 13, we spent some time last week looking at kind of the context of what was going on. We looked at the book itself. You break it into a couple of different sections. First, Paul is addressing issues that were reported to him in the opening chapters, and then he addresses issues that were written to him. They wrote letters to him about these specific answers. And so you see this turn phrase as you go through the book. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, 7:1, and then 8:1, and then 12:1, and then 15:1, and 16:1. There's this constant move where he's answering their questions in the second half of the book. So where we find ourselves is in that second section, beginning in chapter 12, now concerning spiritual gifts, and that covers chapters 12, 13, and 14. Okay? And so we spent some time trying to pay attention to that and looking at the section as a whole. First of all, it opens up with an explanation of spiritual gifts in 12, and then it shows that all those gifts are connected. And he addresses two attitudes that people can develop that ought to be kept at bay. One of which is where you have a person who says, I'm not important. And Paul says there's no way you can say that. The second attitude is when someone looks at another person and says, you're not important. He said that's absolutely impossible to say because you're all part of the same body. Okay? And then he, because they believed that speaking in tongues was the greatest gift, he goes on an excursus and talks about love being a more excellent way. And the word translated way is the word for road. This is a better road to travel. And so then you get to chapter 14, and he shows you when you take the spiritual gifts and you put them together with love, the result is that the church is built up and edified. And so that's what he's trying to do in this particular section. Now, as we continue to progress further, we looked at the chapter where you have, and this was following a common writing style that Greeks used, and Paul, of course, was trained to the highest level at a number of different schools. And so he's probably following this model where you have, it's written in praise of a person or a virtue, okay? And so in doing so, it's extolling the person, or in this case, the virtue, and then it's also calling on people to emulate what it is that they see. And so it begins with a prologue, and that's as far as we got in our study last week, was just simply looking at the prologue. And then you see the actions of that particular person or this particular virtue. And then he moves into a series of comparisons to help drive home that point, and then it closes with an epilogue, a call to action. All right? Now, as we look at our text, last week we talked about this being the course, chapter 12 and verse 31. But earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you still a more excellent way, this more excellent road. Okay? So to be zealous toward the higher gifts, the gifts that actually benefit everyone, and not just that have this tendency to puff up. Because they were elevating tongues because it made the tongue speaker, and by the way, tongue is just a language. That's the idea all throughout the New Testament. It's actually a figure of speech and metonymy where you kind of inverse the order. The tongue is put for what comes off the tongue, which is language. So they were exalting that because, this guy must be something special. He gets up here and he speaks in languages. It's amazing. Not really, because he's not doing it on his own volition. It's not like he knows it. God is giving it to him. But they exalted that because it was one that nobody else could understand. You could kind of talk over everybody's head and view yourself as superior for that. And what Paul tells them is, it's not the best gift. And he will explain that even more in 14, because he says tongues are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers. And he kind of fleshes that idea out as he goes. And so then we looked at the first 3 verses where he calls on us to make a computation of what's going on. And we talked about how this particular section really jolts us into reality. Because he says, okay, you want to take speaking in tongues and make it the greatest gift, okay? Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and do not have love, all I'm doing is making noise. Okay? Well, what about my favorite? What about the spiritual gift that I think is the most beneficial, Paul says, which is prophesying or preaching? And he says, if I have all knowledge and understand all mysteries and have all knowledge and all faith so as to remove mountains, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. Well, what about the ultimate expression of service to God then? What about if I'm willing to bestow all my goods, do what the rich young ruler was unwilling to do, give away everything that I have, and then be willing to give up my body to die as a martyr? Paul said, if you do it, subtract love from that, the only thing you'll do is go from the flames of martyrdom to the flames of hell. What he's getting at is this. Anything we do, whatever spiritual thing you want to put here, you subtract love from it, it's worth nothing. It's a mathematical equation. Gift plus love equals what God wants. Gift minus love, worthless, 0. Okay? So, we spent a lot of time on that section, and now we're going to pick up tonight looking at the actions that are given here. Now, as we've said before in verses 4 through 7, as we talk about this character, we sometimes look at this and say that these are adjectives. Here are descriptive terms of what love is. The only problem with that is that when you look at it in its original context, these are very clearly verbs. They're not adjectives. They're very clearly verbs, which means that they are actions. They're not describing something. They're simply saying love does this. Okay? And so he gives us 15 of these, and I want us to think through them. Obviously, we don't have time. Each one of these things is their own study if you really dive deeply into them. But we want to kind of look and see what's going on here. So in verse 4, he begins with love is patient. Now the word translated patient, and this comes into a translation issue, so patience and endurance, and it depends on which translation you use as to what their translation philosophy was. But the word used for patience here is macrothumia. Okay, so macro in the sense of big or long, like macroeconomics versus microeconomics. You could talk about, say, a national budget versus your own personal budget. Thumos is the word for anger, like temper, flash. And so this particular word here that's translated patience is a word that is not used to describe patience in circumstances. It's used to describe patience with people. He's going to use the word a little bit later that describes being patient in your circumstances. This word means to be patient with people. That's the way it's consistently used throughout the New Testament. For an example, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, the Lord is long-suffering toward us. He's patient with us, not willing that any should perish. He's not quick in coming to anger, and aren't we thankful for that? And so when we think about what it means to be patient, Chrysostom, or one of the other church fathers, said that this is the person who has the power to avenge himself and refuses to. The image that comes into my mind immediately is Jesus at his trial. The ability to avenge himself, being completely mistreated, and yet he doesn't. You see, restraint is something that is a Christian virtue that in that particular time was considered a negative thing. If you restrained yourself, if you were willing to take mistreatment, it meant that you were less than everybody else. And then Christ comes along and he exalts restraint and really models it perfectly in the last moments of his life on earth. And so it's that idea of being patient with other people. Now, as it comes down to even a more practical level, are we patient with people's development? Every person is at a different stage in your spiritual journey tonight than other people. Some of us would probably be on the same stage, same level. Others would be on different levels. 1 John chapter 2, for an example. You've got the fathers, you've got the young men, and you've got the children. Everybody's at different stages in growth and development. The problem comes along when you start looking at people and saying, why can't you be more like, and we don't say it this way, why can't you be more like me? Well, first of all, you're making a huge mistake in assuming that you are where you need to be and you are who you need to be. One of the things I've found is the people who are most impatient with other people have no idea who they really are. They have no idea who they really are. They are not in tune at all with their weaknesses. However, I found just the opposite to be true. The person who is in tune with his or her own weaknesses, and they're constantly thinking through them, constantly trying to work through them, constantly trying to grow, when they look at another person who struggles, they immediately, their heart goes to that person and says, you know what? I struggle too. And it just takes time to develop. Sometimes we want people to change overnight. And it's like, sometimes when we discuss baptism, we sometimes almost treat it like it's some kind of a magical trick. That when a person comes up out of the water, well, now they're a Christian, so they're going to just immediately change everything about themselves. They're going to immediately become a different person. No. And usually what we do is we cut them loose and say, well, I don't understand why you can't get it. But how many times do we do that with our children? When they're born, we say, well, mom says, well, you know what? You lived off me for 9 months. You're on your own. But we do it to new Christians all the time. We've helped you along a little bit now, but now you're on your own. It's totally contradictory. to the New Testament teaching of discipleship. And it's a complete failure to fulfill the Great Commission, which is not just to baptize people, but to continue to teach them. And to remember that their development is not going to go at the rate you think it should go. The same way that your development and my development is probably not going to go at the rate we think it goes. And so we have to learn to be patient. That's hard. But that's what love is. And a person can say, well, you know, that's just how I am. Well, that may be. And that, by the way, that's not an excuse. And the Bible doesn't look... So in Churches of Christ for a long time, we've talked about the importance of calling Bible things by Bible names. Okay? If we're going to do that, then I just can't be patient with people. Then you are not a loving person. There's no other way to put it. Because what is the first action of love? Patience. You want to call Bible things by Bible names? That means more than just pastor versus preacher. You take one thing, you got to take it all. Number 2, love is also kind on the flip side. Not just patient, but it's proactively kind. Tertullian, an early church leader, spoke of the pagans, and the pagans of his day praised Christians who were made up of mildness and kindness. It was a distinct characteristic in their culture that kindness marked Christians. I love the way one writer put it, that kindness is recognizing that everyone carries a heavy load. And I think sometimes we forget that. That everybody is carrying a heavy load. And it's a phrase that's been around for a long time, but I remember my mother saying it to me countless times as I was a kid. Be kind to everyone you meet because everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And you don't want to add something to that. You want to help them carry it. So, as we think about this, so love is kind. Let's take it down to something very extremely practical. If you would talk to people in the food service industry, ask them what is the day of the week they hate the most. Anybody know? Yes, sir. You know why? Rude, demanding customers and poor tippers. To our shame. If I can't be kind to a person, well, they got my order wrong. Good grief. I've gotten 7 things wrong before I got out of bed this morning. When we make the mistake, everybody should be understanding, but somebody else makes the mistake, oh no, that's the end of the world. You're not getting a tip. If we can't practice kindness at the smallest level, how should we ever expect to practice kindness to people who walk through our doors? Number 3, love is patient, love is kind, and it doesn't envy, it doesn't boil over. The idea of intense negative feelings at the achievements of another person. So the question is this: does it bother you when you see someone else do well? Does that bother you? Why can't that happen to me? I'm just as smart as they are. I'm just as qualified, maybe even more qualified than they are. Or, you know, they always make an announcement when he or she does something that's very good, but, you know, I've done plenty of things and even more, and nobody's ever patted me on the back. First of all, I wasn't aware that in Christianity we did things so that people would pat us on the back. Matter of fact, Jesus makes it pretty clear that a majority of it is something that people will never know about if it's practiced correctly. So am I envious at the success of another person? whether that be spiritual success, financial success, career success, whatever it may be. And believe me, it happens. Number 4, love does not boast. I love how one writer described this word. He said this word is used to describe a pompous windbag. Everything is about him. I'll never forget, in my first job, I went to eat with a lady who was very special to us. Brooke and I, probably hadn't been married too long at the time, and he had been the preacher who preceded me, I think. I didn't succeed him, but he was one before the man I succeeded. And so I'm going just to have supper and eat and kind of get to know the guy. Good grief. By the time it was over, I knew who all he had married, buried, and had baptized. And you know, when he goes on, I just wanted to stop and ask him on occasion, did the Lord ever do anything in your ministry? You keep records of the amount of people you've baptized like it's something you've done. Did you die for people? Is it your message that's transforming people? Listen, that's not an insecurity that people have they're trying to overcompensate. That's a lack of love. When I try and elevate myself above other people in my boasting. And very closely connected to that, he says it is not arrogant. The word used here, when you look at it originally, describes how a frog, right before it croaks, you know how its throat kind of swells out. That's what this word carries the idea of a toad that's swelling in its throat right before it makes a sound. Now, here's the question. When we think about not arrogant. So I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm going to probe a little bit deeper, because we're all good church people, and so we're going to obviously answer it the way we think it's supposed to be answered. Do we think we're better than other people? Now, immediately our first response is, no, I don't believe I'm better than other people. This is why the Bible talks about self-deception so much. Are you better than the person who doesn't have a job? You better than him? You better than the unwed mother? Well, I go to church. So what? You know, I read in a very prominent parable that has been wildly misunderstood, and it's even been wrongly labeled, the parable of the prodigal son. The parable of the prodigal son is not about the prodigal son at all. It's about the older brother. And what is it that the older brother says? Now, he doesn't come out and say, you know what, Dad, I'm better than him. What does he say? All these years I've served you, and I have never at one moment transgressed your commandment. By the way, I don't know how he said it with a straight face. I know no child with a perfect record. But do I think that because I come to church, I am better than people who do not? Listen, that's dangerous. I'm not better than them because I choose to obey the Lord. I need the Lord as much as they need him. We don't ever reach this point where we can just kind of phone it in, and our dependence on the Lord now is somehow smaller than it was than when we first began. I don't know where that concept has come from, but it's completely foreign to the New Testament, and old for that matter. So do I think I'm better than other people? Maybe we'll explore that on a deeper level at some point. Number 6, love is not rude. The original Greek term itself may carry with it sexual overtones, that is, behaving in an inappropriate way. Certainly carries with it the idea of being ill-mannered and crude. Basically, I loved what one writer put it. He said, love is tactful. Love is tactful. It's kind of what we talked about in our class this morning. Being tactful. How to help people who are caught in something. How do you go about that? Well, you know, I'm just the person who tells it the way it is. And I'm going to say what I've said a million times about the person who just tells you the way it is. That's only a one-way street. The person who tells it the way it is, if you put it back on them, it's the end of the world. Now, when they get down your throat, you should take it and you should eat it. But when somebody puts it back on them, it's the end of the... Can you believe the way they're treating me? Well, wait a minute now. If you said, I just tell it the way it is, then why is it that I don't get the right to tell it the way it is to you? And when I put reality in front of you, now I'm the offensive one. It's a guise for being rude and unloving. And it's not excusable. Number 7, he lists, love does not insist on its own way. Devotion to one's own self or family or friends. Do I make decisions that are better for the whole or that are better for me and make me more comfortable? Does the church always have to do things my way? So for the last 15 years, I've been paid to serve churches. Do you know how many of them have always taken every piece of advice I've given? None. Nor should they. Because if I believed that they should, it would assume that I believe I've got all the right answers. We have to, if churches are going to thrive, if they're going to be who God wants them to be, if we're going to be loving people, we're going to have to acknowledge we're not the smartest person in the room. You know, some people say if you're the smartest person in the room, you need to find a different room. I would say if you're the smartest person in the room, you need to invite somebody in the room because you're sitting in a room by yourself. Of course you're the smartest person in the room. There's nobody there with you. We're going to have to recognize that other people, they can have legitimate ideas that are better than ours. And that's how we have to operate. Love doesn't insist on its own way. Number 8, it is not irritable, not cantankerous, not given to fits of anger. People that are difficult to get along with, well, you know, he's just a difficult guy. No, he's just an unloving guy. We can call it whatever we want to. But if love is not irritable, and that's an irritable person continuously, they're just not loving. Next, love is not resentful. Keep a record of past mistakes. This Greek term is actually an accounting term. It's the idea of basically keeping record of debts. Like you think of it for us, if you still balance your checkbook with a physical ledger, you're looking at your debts. You're looking at things that you have swiped, money that you have paid, or even money that you owe. Let me ask you something. Do you remember every wrong thing that someone has ever done to you? And do you remind people as often as you can how wrong you were done? That's not what love does. Holding grudges, assuming that somehow we're the ones who set that standard, that they have to satisfy our standards so that they can be forgiven. And even after they're forgiven, we're still going to hold it over their heads. All I can say is this, and I don't mean it in an unkind way, I'm glad Jesus doesn't treat us that way. I'm just glad Jesus doesn't treat us that way. Next, love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. It doesn't find delight in the downfall of others. So here you've got a person, and you're somewhat concerned with the road that they're taking and they're traveling, and you try and help them to reverse course and not be on that journey. And then time comes when the inevitable happens, and that journey leads to their demise in some way, some kind of a major failure. What do? Do you sit back and go, you know what? Told him it was going to happen. Or do I sit back and go, you know, they had so much potential that so sad, it didn't have to end this way. Because the Bible is very clear. You can look in Proverbs, you can look in Obadiah. The whole book of Obadiah is dedicated to this idea. When we rejoice at the downfall of people, God turns away his wrath from the person who is receiving it at the moment and directs it toward the person rejoicing at the fall of an enemy. Love doesn't ever rejoice in wrongdoing, but it rejoices with the truth. It loves truth. Love is more concerned, as we've said many times before, love is more concerned with what is right rather than being right. Too many people are concerned with being right, and they will fight to the death to prove their point. Not only is that immaturity, it's unloving. Love is concerned with what is right. Now, if I may not be right, but if I'm not right, I want to know it so that I can bring myself in line with what is right. Next, love bears all things. Literally, the idea behind the word is it covers with silence. Do you tell anyone who will listen about the sins of other people? You know who's worst about this? Who's probably the world's worst at this? Preachers. Well, you know, he's a good man, but a few years ago, blah, 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 blah. You don't have to say everything you know. You don't have to. Why is it that sometimes we insert that little bit of information in there? One of my teachers used to say that we talk about people and we say, you know, he's a good person, but. And he said, by the time we're done butting him, there's nothing left of them. Love covers it. That's not being naive and sweeping it under the rug, but it's been handled biblically, and there's no reason to go out and tell it to the world. Further, love believes all things. It's not in a hurry to impute false motives. Example. Let's say we looked around here tonight and we said, okay, let's think of everybody who's not here tonight who was here this morning. Well, you know what I can tell? This would be the most unloving thing in the world. You know what I can tell you for certain? Every one of them are laying out because they don't love Jesus. Yikes. Or maybe they're sick. Or maybe they had to work. Or maybe they have a child who's sick. Or maybe they have a sick parent they have to sit with. Love believes what is best in people until it is given a reason to suspect that something else is actually the cause of what's going on. Next, love hopes all things, hoping what is good in another. Do you give up on people? Do you see people for who they are, who their mistakes are, or do you look at people and think of who they could become? You see, because that's one of the biggest short-sighted issues that I see, is we look at people and we look at who they are now, and all we want to do is pitch a fit about who they are now, instead of saying, do you know what Jesus can do with this person's life if we show him Jesus? They'll never change. You really believe that Jesus' power is so small that he can turn his number one enemy in Saul of Tarsus that we studied this morning to his number one advocate? You think he can do that, but he can't help this person? Love endures all things. It never quits. We don't give up on people. I'll never forget when I was a kid, my older brother, we were leaving church that morning. My older brother, he's only about 20 months older than I am, but we were in different classes. I don't remember exactly how old we were. But he was very upset. And when we got in the car, he just kind of exploded. He said, "You're never going to believe what somebody said about Daddy during class." My dad was in the car driving. My father has been scripturally divorced and remarried. Scripturally divorced and remarried long before I was born. Not even a question. They were studying in my brother's Bible class about the qualifications of elders. The husband of one wife. And the teacher said, you see, it'd be like taking Clay's dad, that's my brother, taking Clay's dad. You see, he's been married before. He's the husband of 2 wives. He could never serve as an elder. When I think about it to this day, I have to restrain frustration. Because there were so many things wrong with what that man did in that class. First of all, he called out a kid. But you know, something I have never forgotten. He was upset when I heard it. I was upset. But what I remember the most is my dad saying, "Son, he just doesn't know any better." And that same man, when he struggled with spiritual problems years later, my daddy opening our front door and welcoming him into his office to help him. Because when you love people, you're willing to endure, to help people. You're willing to get over yourself and put yourself aside so that you can help people. Daddy could have written that guy off, and he could have gone, and in every point he could have made his case and could have caused a big stink, could have done all different types of things. He chose to eat it and to love it. And I'll never forget that. So, these are the 15 characteristics of love. The question we have to ask ourselves is, am I doing these things? Now, yet once again, we're not going to finish tonight, so we'll talk about it again next Sunday night. But am I doing these things? Is this who I am? It's not, we talked about this last week, it's not what C.S. Lewis talked about in the Screwtape Letters. So, when he says we have this tendency as human beings to equate knowledge with action. Because I know something, therefore I can convince myself that I actually do that. And if you're honest with yourself, you know exactly what he's talking about. Yeah, I know the Bible says we're supposed to love everybody. And I do love people. Yeah, but when you start asking some tough questions, it's not so clear. When God looks at your life and when he looks at my life, would he characterize us as loving people? I got to be honest with you, and I think I mentioned it last week, the older I get, the more convinced I am of this truth. That the one thing that scares me the most about standing before Jesus one day in judgment is not that I taught something wrong. It's that I mistreated somebody. Because if there is anything that Jesus' life and ministry showed us, it was the value of every single person. And that the mistreatment of them, to mistreat them, is to mistreat him. So the question for us is, what's our life look like? Jesus loves us and always will. And tonight, if someone is outside of Christ, you need to know that Jesus wants to bring you to himself. That's his heart, his desire for you. He's already done the hardest part in giving himself. If you'll receive him with a penitent faith, confessing Jesus to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins, he'll receive you. But as is the case with most of us in here, we're already Christians. Are we loving people? I can't answer that question for anybody but myself. But maybe when I think about it, I realize they don't line up. We'd be happy to pray about that together if it's something you want to deal with publicly, if it's something you want to take. We just want to make sure that in these areas we get the help that we need. And so if we can help you tonight in any way, that's what our desire is. So you can let us know as we stand and sing this song.